the first, but before considering the actual training principles and how they might change for someone who's focused on health versus performance or body composition outcomes, the first thing is actually the intention. And this is something that I think a lot of people miss, because you'll often hear people say that, there's a huge difference between training for health and training for performance. They'll say there's a turn of phrase that, where sport starts, health ends. And it's true to some degree. Like, a lot of people will make certain health trade-offs, but most people who are training for body composition or performance outside of very competitive sports, particularly martial arts and, some other heavy contact sports, they're not willing to accept that much of a trade-off for their performance. Like, for example, the most people who compete in, let's say, bodybuilding, they still have some degree of intention to preserve their health. Like, they're not going all out. Otherwise, you would just use all of the drugs in the world, and you wouldn't care what it did to your liver, or how you felt each day, or how short of breath you were. You wouldn't worry about the quality of your diet necessarily. You just focus on whatever allowed you to, get bigger and stronger over time, and eventually then obviously lose body fat. Now, a counter argument to that might be that, well, that's them preserving their health is only to serve the fact that, it allows them to achieve their goals. And that's true to some degree. Some people just don't really have the intention to preserve their health along the way, but I think most people do. And we all fit somewhere on that spectrum. And that's kind of the key point.
Just on that, like, you're obviously going to find outliers. You're obviously going to find people that are like, oh, I literally could not care less. Give me all of the drugs, give me all of the hard training, give me excess upon excess upon excess. But you can find those people in the general population who aren't training. Like, think about, mates that that go heavy on the drink, or heavy on just recreational drugs. Like, you can find people that are, they just don't care about their overall health, or even just people that, through completely their own fault. And I'm not talking about people that, like, it's like their environment and other things, like people that have access to all of the resources, have the knowledge, whatever, and then still allow themselves to get into a really unhealthy, obese position, perhaps, like, for those, like, people in general, like, if you have access to the knowledge, you are making a willing risk to reward ratio, and you go, I actually just don't care about the risk, all I care about is the reward, whatever that reward is. Like, you're going to find those people throughout society, but we can't necessarily allow the outliers of the outliers dictate how we view the general population, even within these sub populations.
100%. And this is kind of an overarching theme that permeates into many different facets of life beyond just training. For example, like, some degree of work and being financially stable and having a purposeful job, etc., is going to be beneficial for your health. Okay. But there's obviously a point at which health trade-offs start to become a consideration. If you're working 80, 90, 100 hours a week, you're not sleeping enough, your relationships are not being nourished, you're letting the quality of your diet go, your sleep is obviously quite poor, you're super stressed, there's going to be trade-offs in health there. And the question you ask yourself is, how much of a trade-off am I willing to accept? And this is absolutely the same with regards to training, nutrition, and your overall approach. So that's kind of the first thing that I just want you to think about when you're considering how you plan your training and how you plan your nutrition is, what's my intention? What's my genuine intention here? Because a lot of people who will claim that they're doing things solely for health, they don't actually embody that when you look at what they're doing. For example, people might say, oh, I'm just trying to be healthy, and they're staying far too lean for them to be able to maintain a good relationship with food or good psychosocial well-being. So although they might look healthy on the outside, what they're doing mightn't necessarily be so healthful. And then on the other side of things, you might have people who are pretty much solely performance oriented, but pretty much everything they do is absolutely healthful. They're, let's say, competing in a team sport where they've got a solid sense of community. They don't work too much because they want to be able to compete well in their sport. So they've got plenty of downtime as well. They're sleeping a lot because they want to perform well. They're eating really well because they want to perform well. And they're managing their overall level of fatigue or training load because they want to perform well and recover from training. So overall, they're actually doing something that's pretty much close to 100% healthful, despite the fact that that's not their intention at all. So I think first and foremost, consider your intention, and then we can move forward from there.
Yeah, and this is also like the whole discussion, especially when we're talking about sports versus health. Like the thing that mixes a lot of the, we'll call it research on it, and I mean both anecdotal research and the actual literature on this, is that oftentimes a lot of these athletes that we'd be like, oh well, clearly they have ill health as a result of their sport or whatever, it's really because of the drugs that were used in that sport, right? And that's like permeates throughout like recreational sport all the way up to the top level. So when you see studies and it's like, well, athletes have a lower life expectancy because of this disease or whatever, like you have to factor in that it's probably likely that 90% of those people were on drugs, because quite a lot of people, like we're in the industry, like the health and fitness world, we see it all the time. Like we've interacted with, individuals that are on drugs, or individuals that you would be like, okay, that person's not on drugs. And then you come to find out, you're like, okay, you are actually on drugs. Because I'm sorry to have to tell everyone listening to this, and hopefully you're already aware of it, but all of the Olympians that you follow are on drugs. Maybe not all of them, but the vast majority of them are on drugs. We all like to think like, oh, they're, the Americans, for example, put themselves as like a bastion of like, oh, well, we care. We have like we follow the Olympic, rules on drugs and whatever else. But, look at all the medical exemptions for drugs that are clearly performance enhancing drugs, I'm like, yeah, okay, cool. You can talk about medical exemptions, but this was also the story in like the UFC previously, where we had this like testosterone replacement therapy, like a medical exemption from, you're like, oh yeah, cool. And everyone was clearly juicing to the fucking gills. So while they might not be using the same drugs as other athletes who, are not adhering to WADA or the Olympic Committee or whatever else, they're still using drugs. They're still using performance enhancing drugs to some extent. And with any drug, especially if you abuse it to whatever extent you abuse it, there are side effects. It's not like there's a biological free lunch where you just go, oh, I take this drug and I abuse it and there's no ill effects from that. Like that's very rare. That's going to be the case with any drug, like, or any nutrient or anything you put in your body. Like you can abuse water, right? So that does confuse the matter, because you might be a recreational athlete engaging in whatever sport, and you might be really concerned about your health. And as a result, you put a less of a priority on your sport because you're like, oh, well, look, everyone in that sport dies young because of X disease, heart disease, or fucking whatever. But you have to factor in that you're not actually doing that everyone that died young from that was actually doing. You're not doing these crazy high training volumes. You're not doing these drugs. You're not doing X, Y, Z, whatever it is, right? So we do have to look at, okay, we have some like, population data, we'll call it, but we also have to look at you as the individual. Like, what are you actually doing? Which obviously makes this a lot harder of a discussion, because once we start looking at the individual basis, like you might have specific, genetic polymorphisms that predispose you to certain diseases more than another. Or you might have certain genetic polymorphisms that, because you are engaging in this sport, it's actually protective against these different diseases. Like you might have, genetic reasons for having like higher risk of heart disease or arterial calcification or whatever. And because you're an endurance athlete, you weren't actually sick as a result of that, because even though you see like athletes have like higher calcification, but it's not pathogenic, right? So, or as pathogenic, I should say. So like you might be doing things that are actually making you healthier, even though you're engaging in your sport. And we haven't even discussed like the injury aspect of things, because obviously that does also impact on your sport, or impact on your view of health versus, whatever. But the thing about that is it's actually a really hard discussion to have, because if you don't, like, say, what's the two interventions here? We engage in some sort of activities, or we don't engage in some sort of activities. If you engage in activities, you put yourself at a higher risk of injury because you're doing stuff. But if you don't engage in activities, then you put yourself at a higher risk at a later date because you don't have enough muscle mass, you don't have enough bone strength, whatever. So it's like what's the risk to reward here? Now, obviously, there comes a flipping point where you're doing so much activity in your youth that your risk of injury is just higher, or you're doing certain activities where your risk of injury is just higher, and it's not actually leading to a better outcome later in life. So obviously, there is a flipping point. There is a point where you get diminished returns. So we do have to discuss that as well, and we will later on in this episode. But anyway, Gary, any thoughts further to that? Because I think, again, like, getting the intentions right, but also understanding the reality of the situation in front of you, it has to be done before we actually dig into this stuff.
Yeah, and I actually think this is a really interesting part of the conversation that, is a bit tangential, but important nonetheless. And that is, you do see a lot of health trade-offs in elite level sport. And some of those that may not seem immediately relevant to the listener would be things like, for example, you see a lot of athletes upon retirement who will have issues with addiction and various other types of maladaptive behaviors, you could say, whether it be, gambling or alcohol or drugs, etc. And I think there's a couple of interesting components there. One being the attempt to fill a void to some degree, and that's kind of the question of like what role does sport or training or whatever play in your life? Like, is it occupying too much of a hole in your chest so that if you ever need to take a break from training, that's actually going to be severely harmful for your health? Because we do see that quite a bit, even among some clients that sign up, where we actually have to try to get them to, question their own identity, I guess, and ask themselves, what other things compose your sense of identity or sense of self other than fat loss, or dieting, or being the meal prepper, because sometimes that can actually be pathological. And I think you see that to the extreme in athletes when they retire and they have to fill the void with something else, or they have to get their thrills or their dopamine rush from other types of activities. And there's also the fact that people make a lot of money in sport and they get a lot of praise and social notoriety that again affords them opportunities that maybe other people wouldn't necessarily have. So there's all these additional barriers to the sustenance of health later in life. But some of them, those that would be relevant as well for, I guess, now would be, like, for example, I think both myself and yourself, Paddy, like I definitely put myself into the category of someone who's like probably like definitely a risky personality. Like I wouldn't be risk averse. If someone said, do you think you could jump off the house and land on your feet and roll or whatever? I'd be like, yeah, I'll try it. Just stupid. If someone else might call it, but that's how I always was growing up. And I think even now that like different types of activities kind of fulfill that to some degree. Like I think jiu-jitsu and grappling fulfills that to some degree. Like there's certain element of thrill in some of the more dangerous moments, like, and obviously that can be fulfilled in many other ways too. But you ask yourself, is that's not necessarily a healthful personality trait. Well, it could be in some cases, but it might be one of the reasons that you partake in a given sport. For example, some people might partake in, I don't know, downhill skiing or ski jumping or something mad like that. Like you have to be paragliding. Yeah. You have to be a bit of an adrenaline junkie to do that stuff. And while there may again be health promoting parts of that, there's obviously the potential for huge harm there too. And that, like, that's one of the things, is that sometimes sport isn't necessarily just gradually degrading your health, but you might accept a massive risk of real huge downside in an extreme event, such as in grappling or wrestling or something, that you get slammed in your neck and now that's it, you're quadriplegic, or you just die on the spot and that's it. Like super rare events, like very unlikely. It's like in soccer when you get, or field sports in general, some people have sudden cardiac death. Like these things can happen and sports can increase your risk of them, but it's so rare, So yeah, I mean, bit of a tangent, but all very relevant to the discussion of health.
Yeah, and just on that, just on more of the stuff you were talking about, beyond just looking at like, the exercise component or whatever, like the social component of sports, like people forget how much of a a thing that actually is, like, for example, like obviously moved country, right? And I'm just joined a new Gracie Barra Oval in London. And like already, like, you're making friends, you're talking to people. But like, just imagine I didn't do that. Like the only other activity that I really do outside of, working is, going to the gym. And like, you don't really see the same people in the gym always, especially in like London, bigger gyms, or like, more like I'm in a kind of at the gym group, which is more like a fly fit back home, where it's like, you're not really seeing the same people. It's just kind of like a cheaper gym. So you're not really building a huge connection with people there. So if that was me, and I didn't have sport, like I'm not going to make any new friends, I might along the way talk to people in cafes or whatever. Like I'm a, relatively sociable person. But I'm not going to have the ability to make friends because I'm not engaging in a social outlet if I don't do sports. So if you take that away and say, for example, like I came over here injured and, I just wasn't able to engage in any of these things, like I would literally just be sitting in my apartment, So we have to remember that. And especially again, when we talk about like after sport, like what are you going to do to fill that, void? That was one of the reasons I picked up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because I was like, I missed the other sports that I used to do. And like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like you can do that into your old age, it's not like you can change your game depending on what you want to do so that you can do it when you're like 90, so we have to take that into account when we're talking about overall health, because social determinants of health and like social, whatever you want to call it, just talking to people, like that plays a huge role in your actual liveliness, your health in general. So we can't just forget about it, right?